So as we go into the anatomy of our speech sound production, we have to talk about every level of that, where the production comes from. So we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system, and the anatomical structures, which we'll talk about as the speech organs. So you might say, why do I have to learn so much anatomy? And it goes down to where the problem is coming from when we talk about our disordered populations. So phonology is really related to the central nervous system and the areas that are related to storing the phonological rules. Then we talk about motor speech. We're talking about the transmission of signals from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. And if there is any damage in the central nervous system that could cause an error in the transmission of those signals, or if there's a problem in the cranial nerves, or is there a problem at the level of the organs in that very far end of the cranial nerve branch. And then for articulation, we're really just talking about the organs themselves, how they move. Can they make the big movements that they need to make? Can the tongue reach the tip of, can the tip of the tongue reach the roof of the mouth? Can it go between the teeth? Does it go between the teeth at the right time? So let's go into the different areas. We have the peripheral nervous system, which really is just the cranial nerves, and again it relates to our motor speech. And so we have 5 that we really focus on. We have the trigeminal nerve, the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus, and the hypoglossal. So the trigeminal nerve is again for movement of the jaw and opening and closing of the jaw. So think about sounds in our speech that are important for moving the jaw. A lot of that's going to relate to vowels. So if I say E, my jaw is going to be higher up than if I say ah, it's going to drop down. And that movement comes from the innervation from the trigeminal nerve. We also have sensory innervation for the front 1/3 of the tongue. And you might say, well, why is sensation important for articulation? And it goes down to, if we're talking about the front of the tongue, can the front of the tongue feel the alveolar ridge during the production of t or d? Or is it too far back so that it goes k or g? And we have the facial nerve that gives our motor innervation for the lips and the cheeks. And those are really important for sounds like or the M sound, or b, or p. And then again we have that sensation for the front 2/3 of the tongue. So it's working with, that's supposed to be back 2/3 of the tongue. It's working with the trigeminal nerve and that sensory innervation of the tongue. Then we have the glossopharyngeal. That's mostly for sensation of the tongue, the pharynx, and the velum. Then we have the vagus nerve that gives one muscle of the tongue movements. It helps move the velum. So if we say sounds like k or g, we're getting those movements from the innervation of the vagus nerve as the soft palate drops down to touch the back of the tongue. And then we have the hypoglossal nerve, which is the movements of the back of the tongue. So again, with sounds like k or g, the K and the G sounds, when the tongue touches the back of the velum, it's working with that vagus nerve and that hypoglossal nerve together so that the tongue and velum come together to make those sounds. Next up, we have the central nervous system, and I'll go ahead and give a disclaimer of there are many areas involved in motor speech and phonological production, and they are way beyond the extent that we cover in this class. So the only structures that I'm introducing in this course are the ones that we already reviewed in the anatomy lecture, so that you don't have to scramble to figure out how these new areas are involved in motor speech production. So again, there are lots of different areas. The textbook really goes into the different areas, specifically the basal ganglia and things like that. And those are important things to know, but it's just too much for this class. So the 3 areas that we'll talk about are the motor cortex, which adjusts the movements for the speech production. And the motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe. Then we have the medulla, and the medulla isn't so much important for the movement of the speech structures, but it is important for the coordination of breathing patterns. And this will come back around when we talk about dysarthria and our motor speech disorders, because we have to have that coordination and that strength in our breathing to really support the movement of the speech structures or the speech organs. And then the cerebellum. The cerebellum is for the coordination of the activations of the muscles during speech, so it works along with the motor cortex and the sensory cortex and the medulla. And we didn't go too much into the sensations of speech, but again, it is an important aspect of that. So when we're talking about our speech organs, we're talking about how these organs move to create our speech sounds. So I'm trying to make it as distinct as possible for you to understand the difference between phonology, motor speech, and articulation already. But why it's so confusing is because articulation, phonology, and motor speech all use the speech organs. So if there's a problem at the level of the central nervous system, it's going to be displayed down at the level of the speech organs. But the way that the movements of the speech organs change is related to the area of damage or the area of the disorder. So the speech organs really are the lips. Right here in the front, everybody knows what their lips are. Then we have the teeth, the upper and the lower teeth. We have the alveolar ridge, which is that front portion of the hard palate, that's that bumpy area. We have the hard palate itself, and then we have the velum, that squishy area in the back. So in our previous lecture with resonance, we really talked about the nasal portion of the velum and how it lifts and closes against the back of the pharynx. This time we're talking about the oral portion and how it touches the back of the tongue for different sounds. So if you really want to understand the difference, if you go or g, 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 you'll feel the back of the tongue touch the velum. But if I say ma, 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 you're not going to feel that touch, but you'll hear the difference in the resonance of your voice. And then finally we have the glottis. And remember that the glottis is that space between the vocal folds. And the glottis really only is useful for one sound, and that is the H sound. Otherwise, the glottis is really just not necessarily an articulation thing, but it does go into the classification of speech sounds that we'll talk about later and how we have voiced and voiceless speech sounds.